Hello everyone, welcome back. I want to talk to you guys a little bit today about the Vietnam War. Okay, the conventional wisdom today that is generally accepted is that this was a stupid war that was being fought in a stupid manner. Okay, and that's what this video is about. I disagree with that, and I'm gonna go through a whole bunch of reasons why I disagree with it and why I think that it was actually a good war that was actually being fought in a good way, given the time period and the circumstances around it. Okay, and I'll just jump into it, and then I'll give you guys some more information about it. First of all, the Soviet doctrine at the time was that they were going to expand their socialist system to the rest of the world. Okay, so that was doctrine. They were committed to it. And at the point where we're at the Vietnam War, they're pushing that ideology in Vietnam, and we basically go there to stop it. Now, there's a reason why we fought that war the way that we fought it. Okay, prior to the Vietnam, to our entry into the Vietnam War, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, and this is a situation where the United States and the Soviet Union almost went to all-out nuclear war with each other. Okay, so throughout the Vietnam War, we did not want to do anything that would provoke the Soviets into entering the war and it escalating into a nuclear war. And one of the concerns was that at the harbors, right? I'm specifically thinking of the harbor at Hanoi. Okay, that's where the Soviets and the Chinese were bringing in the equipment, and they had advisors there. Okay, it was well known that a good way to end this war really quickly was to bomb the harbor of Hanoi, and all the other points where the communists could supply the North Vietnamese. The reason why we did not bomb the harbor of Hanoi until I think maybe the very end of the war. The reason why we didn't do that is because we knew that there were Soviet advisors there and basically Soviet citizens. Okay, so we did not want to kill any Soviets, which would cause the Soviets to basically want retribution. Okay. So that's the reason why we didn't escalate the war, because it would make it would have made a lot more sense to basically concentrate all of our power and end the war quickly. But our goal at that time was basically not to keep it from spreading, and we knew that if we just completely snuffed out the North, there was a good chance that the Soviets would have came into the war. And it would have escalated into a nuclear war. Now, let's kind of go back to the beginning. Basically, all this starts pretty much through World War II. Okay, World War II, the Americans and the Soviets form an alliance, right? Obviously there was other, there was Australians, there was British, there was other people involved, but the two main players are Americans and the Soviets. And they formed this alliance, and it was it was obvious that we were really enemies, and we were just temporarily working together to defeat the Germans. Okay, and we probably would have immediately gone to war with the Soviets at the conclusion of World War II if it had not been for the fact that we had already drawn up plans as to how Europe was going to be divided after the war, before the war ended. Okay, so that's the only reason why we never actually went to war with the Soviets immediately after the war. But that was a possibility. I mean, there was lots of generals, and I believe Patton was one of them, that were saying, let's just start this war with the Soviets and just get it over with. But that, I believe that's one of the reasons why Patton had a fatal accident. But that's another video. So it was expected that after the war there would be these conflicts between the United States and the Soviets. And the reason for this is because the Soviet doctrine was one of expansion. They knew the communists knew that they could not compete with freedom. Okay, so they had to completely, destroy it. They had to expand to the entire world, or eventually, their socialist ideas would be defeated by the Free West, which is what actually happened. But in order to prevent that from happening, they wanted to expand their system. Okay, so that's their policy. Okay, and what happened was, in addition to the United States and the Soviets working together in Europe, we were also working together in Asia against the Japanese. And part of the reason why I believe we dropped those nuclear bombs in Japan, because we wanted to end the war quickly, before the Soviets had a chance to really get into Japan and help us, because if the war had gone prolonged, and the Soviets had basically gotten into Japan, then basically Japan would have been split as well. Half of Japan would have ended up communist. So what happened was, but when we dropped those bombs and the Japanese surrendered, the Soviets had basically they had because remember, they were fighting the Soviets were actually fighting the Japanese in Manchuria, basically China and areas of Korea, and so they didn't get all the way to Japan, but they did get into Korea. So after the Japanese surrender, Korea ends up being split. And basically, very quickly after the war, the Soviets go back to their policy of expansionism, and we get this conflict in Korea, where we have the Korean War. Okay, and that was a very rough war. It was probably the last time in our history so far that the United States military was actually routed at one point of the war. Right? They were like in a full-blown, uncontrolled retreat before they were able to reorganize themselves and mount some type of a counteroffensive. So eventually, what happens is we end up with a stalemate. Both sides decide to leave that alone, and then what happens is that conflict basically moves to Vietnam. But before we get to Vietnam, the Soviets decide to make a play for Cuba. Okay, which is really basically off the coast of Florida. So, and then we end up with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, now the Cuban Missile Crisis, basically we almost went to all-out war with each other. Okay, so this is the last thing that happens immediately before the Vietnam War. So going into the Vietnam War, okay, we want to stop communist expansion in Vietnam, but at the same time we don't want to trigger an all-out nuclear war with the Soviets. So that kind of forces us to fight a somewhat conservative war. Now, with everything that I just told you in mind, what are your alternatives? Okay, I mean, you don't want the communists expanding to the rest of the world, and at the same time you don't want to provoke an all-out nuclear war. So where does that leave you, right? If you're a military general, that puts you in a position where you have to fight that war in Vietnam exactly the way those generals fought that war in Vietnam. So they weren't stupid, and it wasn't a stupid war. They did the only thing that they could do, and they did it pretty successfully. They did manage to stop the expansion, and they did manage to prevent an all-out nuclear war. Okay, so why did we get out of Vietnam? Okay, why all of a sudden at some point was that not a was the communist expansion not an issue? Well, going all the way back to World War II now. Basically, the Soviets saw themselves as the leader of the communist war, and then basically once basically they put their puppet government in China, right? Once as they moved against the Japanese in China, they put their puppet government there, and the Soviets expected that they would basically be the puppet masters, right? And the Chinese would do their bidding. And what's happening over the years is that there's this break. The Chinese communists don't want to do what the Soviets are telling them to do. So you start seeing this, this conflict between the Soviets and the Chinese. that the United States was really not aware how bad it was. Okay, all through the Vietnam War, we assumed that the Soviets and the Chinese were allies. They're working together. They're going to fight us together. Okay, and then something happened in 1968, 69, one of those 2 years, I forget. It doesn't matter which year so much, but I believe it was 68. Something major happened. Something that is really not talked about too often. Okay, in the conflict between the Soviets and the communist Chinese got so bad that the Soviets actually made plans to launch a nuclear attack on China. Okay, but before the Soviets did that, they basically went to the United States. Right, they went to the Nixon administration, and they told Nixon their plans. Say, listen, we're gonna level with you. We want to tell you what we're gonna do, but we don't want you to think that it's an attack on the United States. We got, this is not an attack on the United States. This is just an attack on China. We are going to drop nuclear bombs on China. So the United States basically, Nixon, through his people, told the Soviets that we would oppose them, that we would, if they dropped a nuclear bomb on China, we would immediately counter by dropping nuclear bombs on 130 Soviet Union cities. Okay, so that was the bluff. Probably it was probably a bluff, but it worked. Okay, so Nixon actually prevented the Soviets from making a nuclear attack on China. So he doesn't get credit where credit is due. He prevented that. Now, I'm not a Nixon fan, but it's not for the reasons that you think. I'm not a Nixon fan because Nixon was anti-gun. Okay, he had plans to basically completely ban handguns within 10 years. He said. So he was very anti-gun. So for that reason, I'm not a Nixon fan. But on all other things, Nixon was successful. Now, a lot of people will point out that, Nixon was a crook. Nixon pretty much did everything, broke all the laws that Kennedy broke. Kennedy, did things like order the IRS to go, after his political opponents. He was spying on his political opponents. So Nixon did everything that Kennedy did. It's just that in the era that Kennedy was doing things, basically he was not being scrutinized to the same level by the media. Okay, at the time period that Nixon was doing pretty much the same exact things, things had changed a little bit, and basically, Nixon was caught. Okay, so it's not a question. In this aspect, Nixon and Kennedy were equally bad. They both did the same bad things. And there was, in Nixon's mind, this was what he was probably thinking is like, I'm just doing what everybody else has done before me, because remember, Nixon was active, through those Kennedy years. So to him, this was like, why all of a sudden is everybody making a big deal about this? That's probably what Nixon was thinking through the whole Watergate scandal. Okay. But giving Nixon the credit that he is due, he did stop a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and China, and this would have been a preemptive strike by the Soviet Union on China. Don't take him for granted on this, because he could have taken the position that, the Chinese are communists too. Who cares if they kill each other? That is a position that I think a lot of people might have taken, okay, in his place. But Nixon did say that no, he didn't want a nuclear war, and that he wanted to give them a deterrent. Okay, the Chinese at that point in time were not in a position to offer a deterrent to the to the Soviets. So Nixon did that in their place. Okay, he said that he would counter with a nuclear attack if they attacked the Chinese. So, again, going back to the original point that I was trying to make, the war in Vietnam was not idiotic, okay, and it was not fought in an idiotic manner, okay. It was fought for the reason of stopping the expansion of communism, which it did, But what happened was Nixon looked at the situation, right, and he basically said that, you know what, this war is about stopping the expansion of communism. It was built on the premise that the communist world would unite and work together to expand. And what he saw in 68, 69 was that the communist China, communist Russia, these communist Soviets rather, the Soviets and the Chinese were at a point where they were ready to basically go to war against each other. So I believe that Nixon made the logical conclusion that you know what, we really don't need to be doing this, right? Because if they're fighting each other, if they're at the point where they're ready to go to war with each other, they're not going to be doing much expansion. So that's really the point of this video. So if you guys got any comments, please post them. If you got any additional information, there's obviously so much history, I can't cover everything because there's a lot of history there. But I think that this point about why we got out of Vietnam, okay, because this is the reason why I think we got out of Vietnam. When the Soviets announced that they had plans to drop nuclear bombs on China, at that point I think that the United States, basically said, you know what, their policy of expansionism isn't going to work anyway because they're at war with each other. So if you guys like this video, share it, give it a thumbs up. If you're not members, subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.